Morning. Welcome to another episode of the Pricing Committee Daily. Today we're talking about storytelling. And if we think of the biggest assets and the biggest companies over the last few years, they've been communication companies. If I give you an example, say in a corporate office, any office, they generally have Microsoft Office, whether they like it or not, or Google Suite, but mostly Microsoft Office. Now, if you think of the most used tool in the office probably since the early noughties is Excel. Now, Excel is really a communication tool. It communicates numbers. If you're an analyst, it communicates spreads or how much the stock is valued or how much the spread option is valued. As we used in investment banking, it communicates something in a way that you could have done before. You could have done on sheets, on pieces of paper, but in a much more efficient way from a storytelling perspective. But even more important than that, if you look at certain groups I worked in finance many years, within certain spheres and certain organizations, the ones that have done really well over the last 20 years are the ones that have adopted new communications. And so in marketing, it would be initially, I suppose, good at PPC in Google, then it would have been maybe Facebook Meta next, and then Snapchat, Pinterest, etc., Reddit particularly now. A lot of the AI LLMs use Reddit as a source, like it or not, or believe it or not. That's only increased. And all these powerful companies are really communication companies, whether it be obviously Google, the communication company, whether it be the web, etc., and YouTube. Then you have meta communication, pictorially, you may argue. And Microsoft is similarly a communication company. Doesn't actually look like it is, but essentially, if you think about PowerPoint and how PowerPoints are used in today's world in corporate, in my mind, they're overused. And if you take the kind of Jeff Bezos view that you're not going to do any PowerPoints, you're going to write it in like almost in blood over 6 pages, then we're going to sit down and read it over 20 minutes and discuss it for the next 40. They're a very different model, but most companies love PowerPoints. And you could argue that PowerPoints are storytelling. And so whether they're 10 pages, 20 pages, 200 pages I've seen in some board reports, they're really a form of storytelling. And the question is, what story are you trying to tell? And the reason why I said this at the start of the kind of news review is to say, what are we actually aiming for? In reality, the most important companies, let's say the Google, the Facebooks, or Meta, etc., are the Twitters, even though it's not financially that important, but culturally it is, are communication companies. And so somehow the LLMs will have to fit into that world where people want to communicate. And there are new forms of communication, shorter, longer, sexier, not so sexy, more mathematical. But essentially, we live in a communication world. We live in a kind of media-on world where everybody, including myself trying, is a media creator of some sort. And that really sets up what are we trying to do. Communication is storytelling, but it's also some sort of compression of knowledge. And if we move on to the first article, it's kind of talking about PNGs and lossless compression. And this is something that we kind of forget now. I'm long in the tooth, so I kind of remember the early days, but not well enough. And if you go back 25 or so years, you would have had problem storing video files, which YouTube solved more efficiently than anybody else. Everybody could do videos back in the kind of 90s, but early noughties, but YouTube were very efficient at deprecating that and obviously allowing that to live in the cloud much quicker than anybody else because they're able to compress the videos much better in a kind of lossy way, but in a way that obviously could be replayed on the tools that we had at that time, which weren't as powerful as the tools that we have now. So if we take that there is lossy and lossless, and if I give you my accountant view of lossless and lossy. Lossy is like a JPEG. You can expand it a little bit, but it kind of loses shape quite easily. And if you were to really expand it, it would look shit. Let's be fair. PNG is much more expandable. The pixels are stored pretty much as is, but they're compressed, and you can expand that. And if you really want to go like artistic, I don't know what it stands for, but SVG, which is, I think it's some sort of scalable vector graph, or scalable something graphic anyway, scalable vector graph. So you can scale that baby up massively, almost like on posters, etc. So this is stuff like you get in Adobe and stuff, beyond an accountant, more for designers and product managers and stuff like that. So there are various different forms of storing that information, and each one obviously has a certain body of storage cost related. JPEGs is normally quite cheap, PNG is more expensive, and SVG, because it's storing more in a much more kind of lossless compression mode, it's basically able to extend and expand bigger, but also is basically takes up more storage. So why do I say this? Well, this is in the context of, I myself have been using LLM for like two and a half years, and generally on both ends, what I put in and also what I get out, it tends to be, let's just say, too long. And we have to find a way of compressing that if we're ever going to get token spend. Anybody who knows me knows I'm obsessed by the fact that, yeah, we're using all these value models, etc. But in reality, the cost of the model will be the most important factor in terms of what's successful and what's not. So when you see it in that sense, you say, okay, then the lossless compression, or even lossy compression, which we have now, has to somehow be improved. And if you're going to use an analogy, you could argue currently we're at the kind of JPEG level where I'm putting in stuff which is a little bit flabby. It's definitely producing flabby information. That has to somehow be PNG'd, where we can basically codify that in a much more simple way, or deduplicate, I think they say, deduplication. And it becomes almost like a framework which obviously can be easily understood, a worldview easily understood, and can be expanded, but in its essence, really is very, very simple. And I think sometimes people talk about the projects and the context, and what's another word people are using nowadays? Somehow where they're able to basically compress the context into a format where it's almost intuitive what the machine should do with it, the LLM, etc., in terms of expanded. I've tried that with many different diagrams and models with lots on. That has worked to a large degree, where you can compress, say, a monetization strategy into one diagram. That is normally enough for like a kind of 95% compression of all those elements, because all it would do is read that, and then it knows it can infer the rest from the internet. So that really sets up our first article, which is about Netflix trying to work on a way of lossless compression. So let's just go over that article right now. So this is from the Register, and it's an article about Netflix thinking about how can they create lossless context compression, which is kind of what we were talking about earlier, which is how do I find a way of simplifying what I'm trying to say into such a very, very tight space, a view, a worldview, a context, a diagram, a framework, whereby basically using less tokens. If we believe that we are living in a token world and most of the value will be on a meter, whether the value we deliver to the clients and we're charging usage-based pricing, which people hate, but that's the way it's going, as we can see with Copilot, and also what we ingest via procurement, contracts, ELAs, etc. We are basically going to be yield farming the difference in what we output and what we ingest. And that yield farming, which is a terrible name because people use it in crypto, is essentially working out the difference between, well, I need some seeds and then I got to grow some stuff and then obviously got to sell it in market. And that basically is a very, very STP, straight through processing concept of I get tokens in, I convert the tokens to something, And then obviously that something is hopefully worth more margin than they actually be paid for. And you could see that in terms of maybe in terms of more a refinery. Refinery gets in, say crude oil, and then it has to refine it into gasoline in America or petrol in the UK, various different types, would be kerosene, different petrochemicals, which make plastics, etc. It has to take that one product and pretty much put it through a massive combobulator and produce many different things on the back of it. And to take a certain aside, why have there been so few refineries built over the last 50 or so years, I believe? I think the last big ones were built in the 70s, 80s in America. One, because obviously the oil price is very, very choppy, so it's a huge investment in the billions. Two, you could argue that obviously there are better use of capital if you have enough refinery around the world, but also it's actually quite complicated. And it's complicated because obviously you've got old technology and old ways of doing it, but you can obviously forget that. But what it really signifies in terms of AI is that the refinery itself isn't as easy as people make out. People assume because we know how to use AI, we know how to use AI efficiently. And that's the one thing that companies, maybe Google, with its full stack from TPUs all the way to serving us via Gemini and the cloud, and maybe Netflix, which similarly worked out a way of how do I basically compress, just like YouTube did, a different business model, how do I compress all this information and all these crazy, incredibly big files of content into somewhere where obviously I can replay it back to hundreds of million people with a little bit of fidelity loss, but not too much. And so the example would be, could I always show a Netflix TV show on an IMAX cinema? Yeah, I probably could. But would it be as good as something particularly designed for IMAX? No. But in that sense, Netflix and YouTube and Google have worked on lossless context compression in some way, context being movies, the YouTube videos. And that's kind of where we need to get to. It's not where we are with, you could argue, the current web, because the current web was really monetized by excessive articles being excessively long, excessive listicles, which you could advertise against each one. Now we're moving away from that world where it's kind of a one-shot deal. You wanted an answer, I gave you an answer. I might have used many different contexts, but I gave you one answer. Therefore, we're in the context compression mode, not in the let's basically show you 15 articles so you have to cipher through them. So I think that's one of the first contexts of saying, how do we move to another world? And obviously people like Netflix, Amazon, and what are their names? Obviously Google will obviously be way ahead of this curve. So let's move on to the next article. So this article really feeds into the same thing of people are using too many tokens. And so we've come through maybe a 2-year period where initially you had very few people using it. Now they've kind of token maxed and everybody was using it to try and to basically R&D some value. But now that's becoming quite expensive for many reasons. The next article we'll come on to will be at the IPOs briefly. But the IPOs really signal the fact that we've got to get more cost efficient. We've got to do some more, let's just say, financial shenanigans, whether it be the gaps, the discounts, the RPO stuff. We've got to do a little bit more basically to try, to work out how to save money, essentially. And whether you're Amazon or you're Google or you're Uber or whoever you are, Microsoft, cost to cost. And so as we've seen with the Microsoft pullback, rumored where they're not going to use Claude Code as much, if at all. Then you've got Amazon basically also saying that actually we've kind of been token maxing. We had leaderboards, we had ways of encouraging you to basically use AI, probably too much. Almost in the sense that you had kind of the Google 20% back in the day when developers were allowed 20% to reinvent the world. I think Google Maps came out of that kind of free time to reinvent the world. So this basically says, look, we don't have endless amounts of money. We thought we had and we were cash rich, but now we're not. we're borrowing money, we're sometimes even issuing equity, I've heard recently. And we don't have shit tons of expense and leeway to basically report this sort of stuff to the market, who are already getting a little bit jittery. So this, along with the kind of the Google full stack, along with obviously the Microsoft, is really the end of the token maxing being a thing of something that people think is valuable. So that brings on to the last article, which is about IPOs and why companies particularly need to be not just cautious, but also a bit more scientific the way they report numbers, given that everybody's going to pour over these S1s and try to work out what the hell is going on. And if we take this last article about Alphabet trying to raise some equity, which one seems odd given that most companies are buying back stock, but maybe not so much Google over the last, but Apple definitely and other companies. So this is on the back of really the costs are too high. And they've been spending lots of money in infrastructure and influence and subsidies, essentially monetization subsidies. So the question would be is, where the money comes from. And to a large degree, most companies, Meta, whether it be off balance sheet, etc., have gone to the debt market by some means or forms, where Alphabet's basically saying, actually, we think the shit is going to hit the fan, and we would rather have more equity capital, which we can simply dilute the return for, because you're not going to get rid of them if you want, as opposed to having debt out there, which is much more debt, which is obviously easily marketable and basically moves up and down, up and down, up and down, which is a bit problematic if you want to manage the narrative. And so the market didn't react particularly well for this, but I think this is really a bellwether for the IPOs, in the sense that the IPOs will probably ask the market to ingest if you think about total market cap of 1 billion, 1 trillion, 1 trillion, that's Anthropic plus OpenAI plus 1.5 to 2 for what we're talking about SpaceX. So that could be adding a few more issuances. You're probably talking about 4 trillion in total. Obviously, they're not going to float that much, but even if they float 10% of that, you're looking at 400 billion worth of ingestion required by the market. And that is primarily because we don't have the most efficient end-to-end way of refining the information. One, the contexts like mine, if you take an example, are quite flabby. Two, the models are, let's be fair, a little bit flabby compared to some of the competitors, say, maybe even China. And then the outputs are insane. And so all of those things, from the model being a little bit flabby, maybe a bit over the top for what we need, to the context and the data we're putting into it being a little bit flabby and over the top, to the outputs being horrendously flabby. It's basically a refinery which is bringing in $100 crude or $150 now, and basically turning out products which only have a value of about $50 or $60. That's never going to work for a refinery. And so this move, whether it be equity or debt issuance and the IPOs that are being talked about, are really only about, I need enough cash to see this efficiency play through. Now, Google, Alphabet will probably be the most efficient, and we've seen that with some of the Gemini stuff, 3.5, etc., and the whole full stack. They're betting that the whole game is about compression. How do we compress the information in? How do we compress the model size? And how do we compress the inference and outputs to form that can make us profitable on a simple margin, straight through process? If you see it in that way, then the drive to lossless compression and lossless context compression is really the most important thing that people aren't talking about. How can I make this super, super, super efficient end-to-end, refining this information all the way from the big models, the context people put into it, and then the context and the output they get out of it. And it's not necessarily the perfective answer being the winner. It's the one who can really, really condense that context stack all the way from what the model needs to what we put in to what we output. That's probably the name of the game. And if you look at YouTube, it's very, very similar. Even today, with technology kind of known, other than network effect, there's very, very few players that could industrially scale up, even if they had the money to do so, to the level of engineering and compression and tooling that, say, Google and YouTube have, or Alphabet and YouTube have around YouTube. And that alone shows you the problem, that this will be compounding. Those that are able to compound their engineering to really, really get compression to a fantastically high level will be the long-term winners. YouTube wasn't necessarily a winner in 2006 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10. Really only 10 years later that it went completely clear of the audience and no one else could even attempt to compete with YouTube. Network effects, yes, but also the engineering sublime. And if you think about AI not in some sort of abstract way of becoming human or all the other nonsense people talk about, but a refinery of information in, refinery, and kind of petrochemicals, many different distillates and things that come out of it after it's been cracked. That is much more the way that Google are thinking and Alphabet are thinking. And that's why they may be one of the earliest winners over the next 2-3 years if the money starts to run out. So that's the pod for the day, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
The pricing committee, velvet rope cartel, turning every checkout into Dante's seventh hell. Can we simplify? Gets treated like a crime, cause complexity looks smart when you present it in a slide. Every metric looking healthy till the profit disappear, like magic trick performed by venture capitalists of the year. Net retention floating high like a helium parade till the AWS invoice enters with a switchblade.